Yo, yo, yo. This is Candy B Knittin. I'm Candy B. I be knitting. And today I wanted to give you the rundown on my finished object. Well, 99.9% finished object. The Vertices Unite by Stephen West that I've been knitting is done. I'm done with the knitting part. The only thing left is the blocking part. And so I wanted to kind of go deep dive into the pattern and tell y'all what I think of the pattern and what I think of the completed object. So this is the Vertices Unite shawl by Stephen West. Was first published in, is published in West Knits Best Knits Volume 1 shawls, but it's also available on Ravelry and Stephen and Penelope as a single pattern. And this is a shawl I knitted. It comes in the small size and the large size. I knitted the large size, and I knitted on size 4 needles, and I did an I-cord bind off with a size 5 needle. The yarn I use, I'm going to quickly talk about the yarn because I mostly want to talk about the pattern, and I can talk about the yarn at a different date. One, because I have not blocked it yet, and so I don't really want to talk about too deep into the yarn until I block it and see what it looks like once it's been blocked. And two, most of the yarn, actually, I guess you could say 80% of the yarn that I used is not available anymore. So this green, wrong end, this green is Woolen Boon Skinny, and the colorway is Summer Vibes. It's 100% superwash merino. Woolen Boon no longer dyes yarn anymore, so it is what it is. This yellow color that you can see striped in here is my own hand spun, made out of Neighborhood Fiber Co. Cobblestone Roving, which is 75% Blueface Leicester, 25% silk. This is non-superwash, and this is the colorway Del Rey. I guess you could say more than 80% is not available because you would have to hand spin exactly the way I hand spin to get this exact yarn. But they do still dye, and you can still get this base, and you can still get this colorway. And then the majority of this shawl, the purple you're seeing, the red you're seeing, the blue you're seeing, are these 3 yarns that I got at a craft thrift store called Scrap Be More. And this is Yarn Rehab, which also mostly now goes by the name Meadowcroft Dyeworks. So they still do dye, but they don't dye this base anymore. And this base is their Lorn base, and it is a superwash merino singles yarn. This whole shawl is made out of singles yarn. Which is another reason I want to block it first and then tell y'all what I thought about knitting with singles, because I know a lot of people are hesitant about knitting with single ply yarn. But this is the Lorn base. I had to do some Ravelry searches because I don't have the ball bands for all of these because they came from the thrift store. So this one is Delirious, the red. The blue came with a tag that said it was black opal. I looked on Ravelry. It could be the black opal. I don't necessarily agree that I would call this color black opal, so it kind of threw me off, but this is it. And it is blue with some dark blue spots and some purple spots. And then this light purple color, the closest colorway I saw on Ravelry, and it's got some pinkishness to it. And I believe this might be the Jazz colorway. But it's neither here nor there because they don't dye this base anymore. So let's get into the actual shawl itself. I started knitting this. I looked back at my YouTube history, which is now very helpful for me. And I started this February 17th, and today is April 20th. And so almost exactly 2 months to knit this, which is about average for me knitting a shawl. But overall, it did not feel like it felt like it flew by because I think because it is knit modularly, It really didn't feel like I was just like slogging through, and you get to towards the end of a shawl that's growing and growing and you're knitting back and forth, and sometimes it can feel like it's just dragging, and this really felt like it flew by. And so I'm just going to take it section by section. Like I said, this is what you would call a modular construction. You knit one section, and either you knit this first section 1, and that is where the bulk of the knitting is, and that's colors A and B, the blue and the green together. And it does feel, it felt like this part probably took me the longest, and this kind of dictates the size of the rest of the shawl. So if you personally were knitting this shawl and you wanted it to be a little bigger, a bit bigger or a bit deeper, this is where you would make your adjustments. And yeah, this part was, I forget what I was saying. I completely blanked out. So this is section 1. I started here. The whole shawl itself flew by, but this is probably the biggest part. And so this part probably took me the longest. And this, like I said, dictates the size of the rest of the shawl. I did have one little blip in here where, you're striping your colors A and B. And I did, at one point, I think I repeated the blue, and so I just had to kind of read the pattern to figure out the shape I was supposed to make. I did also miss one of the instructions. It tells you specifically where to mark, because you're going to be picking up stitches in order to knit the rest of the shawl. I think that's what I was going to say. I was going to say something about how once you knit this piece of the shawl, the rest of the shawl pretty much involves picking up stitches, and so that's what the modular construction comes from. I think that's what I was going to say. Oh well, we do this in one take here. So this is section 1. Flew by. It was pretty fun. I like this kind of almost like kite shape you get. It's like a parallelogram you're knitting. You start on one end, you get wider, then you get skinnier again. I could see myself taking any one of these blocks and kind of riffing on it and doing my own thing. I think if I kind of kept going with this just one shape, I could have made a pretty interesting shawl just out of that one puzzle piece, I guess you could say. Section 2, like I said, section 1 is the most knitting. And then section 2, you pick up the section down here. The pattern also involves a lot of short rows. So in case you're not familiar with this pattern and maybe you're a beginner knitter, the skills that you either need or you will need to learn: picking up stitches, slip knits, knit 2 togethers, in short rows. And Stephen West is very vague about his short rows. He's just like, I guess the closest you could call it is a wrap and turn, but you could literally use any type of short row technique you would want for this pattern. Some people, I prefer German short rows, but I just did it exactly the way Stephen West talks about it in the pattern, and he has tutorial videos all about it. So this next section down here was, I call it a break section, because you had this big area you knit here, and then here you pick up all of these stitches, and then you're doing short rows. And this I did in maybe 2 days. It just flew by. I was a little nervous with the yellow and the purple because they are complementary colors, but I feel like I got more of like the oranginess of the purple. Oranginess of this yellow colorway. And so I think these two it was more of a warm yellowy orange, and I think it complemented the purple very well. Then we get to section 3, which is probably the second most knitting you will do in a section of this shawl. And I want it to, because one of my goals and one of my thoughts this year, if you go back and watch my 2024, I guess you could say brainstorming video, I think is what I called it. One of my goals this year was to use these 3 yarns, because I've had these, I got these from the thrift store, I bought them together, and I was just like, oh, this is going to be really easy for me to make something. And I was like just absolutely stumped, because while they're all the same base, I could not figure out how to make them work in a project together. And that's why I ended up doing this project, because of the modular nature. It just kind of felt like I could make it work in this setting. And in embracing that idea, I decided, you know what, this red, the red was really what was throwing me off, because I do not have a lot of red yarn. And so I thought I would just kind of embrace the whole challenge of using this yarn together in a project by being like, you know what, I'm gonna just do the one huge big section in just red. And it actually became my favorite section, and I like the way the yarn knit up. I like the way the block knit up. It's a rectangle knitted on the bias, and I just think it came out just super clean and super lovely. And I was probably the most nervous about this section going in, and I was kind of mentally prepared to be like, oh, maybe, you know, section 3 should be a different color. But then just seeing how this played out was a lot of fun. And so then you knit section 3, then you get another break, and you go into section, no, section 3 is pretty simple. Then you go into this section 4, and section 4, if y'all recall, is where I really struggled, because there was a lot of, first of all, you're striping 2 colors, then you're increasing, decreasing on certain sides, then knit front and back is another skill you would need for this pattern. I'm also picking up stitches. I'm also, you know, there's specific instructions in the pattern about, you know, slipping one with yarn in front, and it came out very well. But this is the section where I had a few little blips as far as picking up my stitches. Actually, no, this one is okay. It was actually section 3 where I had to pick up those stitches, and I have some, I think, some areas where I didn't put my yarn in front, or I twisted my yarn in a weird way, and so the wrong side is not as visually pleasing as I would like. I think this was also when I was talking, I had a video a few weeks ago where I talked about my slip knits not being as neat as I would have liked them. But you can see now, even now, I'm having trouble remembering where I had trouble. So it's not that big of a deal. It's on the wrong side of a shawl that I'm going to wear on my back. So I really wasn't super concerned with going back and trying to figure out where I went wrong here. And it's maybe 4 or 5 different places where maybe, like I said, maybe I didn't slip. I'm thinking maybe that's what happened. I didn't slip, so now I have like instead of having a nice clean selvage edge, I have just kind of like a twisting there. So then section 4, there's more striping and increasing and decreasing, and you're making these shapes. And then section 5, I feel like, is a nice little break, and all you're doing is going between these sections and filling in this area here with this color, and it's just using one color and it's filling it in, and it's a really just small section, and it's just like a little mental break. The only thing about, and that's it goes back to this section 1 being kind of dictating the final size of the shawl, because you're picking up all of those selvage edges you create. So if you're a little bit, you know, short, if you're a little bit longer, that's going to decide how big this triangle is. And there were areas where I got off on my stitch count, or maybe my selvage edges didn't match up with where the pattern was going to be. But I'm going to get to what I liked and what I didn't like about the pattern, and that's one of the things I did like, was that it was very clear to me, hey, maybe the stitch count doesn't match, but it's very obvious that I'm supposed to fill in this area, so I'm just going to keep picking up stitches until I'm done picking up stitches. Then section 6, last but not least, this was probably my least favorite section because I was working with my least favorite yarn. And I just really struggled. By the end of the pattern, I figured out how I could have done it better. So basically, once again, you're doing short rows and you're creating more triangles. The pattern is mostly using short rows, to create all of these different stitches and using increases and decreases to decide how it biases. And I was very much concerned with making sure I was doing my short rows in the right place, and doing, short rows involves going to your last turn and knowing where your last turn was. And so my brain was very much focused on that. But at the same time, to get this to slant in the way it needs to, you're doing increases. And I was getting very confused on where I had increased and where I had decreased. And I probably should have done something to mark where my increased rows were, but I was very much focused on doing my short rows. In the end, I only ended up being off 1 stitch, which was more frustrating to me than being off 5 stitches. Like, oh man, I just messed up on 1 row. But at that point, I was just like, I don't have the mental fortitude to go back, because you're not I'm used to increasing maybe every other row, and this is like a 4-row repeat. And so I was just like, yeah, I've gotten some tips. Like sometimes I'll post on Instagram and someone will be like, oh, I put my stitch marker here for that. And I've gotten help like that before, but now that I've knit it now, I can be like, okay, next time I knit this, I'm going to put maybe a stitch marker on the last row I increased on. And I think that would be much more of a visual cue for me, because I do this thing, and y'all have heard me say this before, where I think I'm going to remember something and I never ever do. So I'm just like, oh, I'm increasing at the beginning of a row. Surely I'll remember that by the end of the row. But by the end of the row, I'm thinking about where my last turn was, and I've completely forgot. And so many times I would knit back and be like, did I increase on this row? And I'm trying to read my stitches. And so I could get better with that. That's not a fault of the pattern at all. And also I'm knitting, there's a point in here where there's 150 stitches at a certain point. And I'm like, yeah, especially if I'm watching TV too, if I'm knitting a whole row, I completely forgot if I knit front back at the beginning of that row. Then after you do all of these pieces, you pick up all the stitch, because there are areas where you have live stitches and you put stitches on hold. Oh, my bag is all the way over there. Another little pro tip. I now have an interchangeable needle set, so I was able to put some stitches on hold on my cords. But I didn't have enough cords for all of that. So a little pro tip is I have crochet thread or mercerized cotton, and I like to use this to use as waste yarn, because it comes out really, really smooth, especially when you're working with really fuzzy wool yarn. So at the very end, you pick up every single live stitch, and you pick up and knit every single selvage row, and you do an I-cord bind off on the entire shawl. Normally, I like to use DPNs to do an I-cord bind off. I will tell y'all, I did use my 40-inch chow goose to pick up all the stitches, and it's probably the most stitches I've ever had on chow goose. I needed all of those 40 inches. I probably could have used a 60-inch cord and still felt like it was tight. I have never had an issue with my chow goose. My oldest chow goose needle is probably 2 years old at this point, so take that with a grain of salt. But I have seen on Instagram people post pictures of broken chow goose needles, and I'm like, how did they break their chow goose? If there was any way to break your chow goose, it's picking up that many stitches and then trying to pull the cord as you're doing an I-cord bind off. My issue is I am quite lazy, and I honestly didn't feel like getting up to go get my DPN. And so basically what I would have done is I would have had my cords, which also I could have probably, because I think I own 2 sets of size 5 needles, so I probably could have put half of them on one 40-inch, half of them on another 40-inch. But basically I was sitting there with the whole shawl balled up on a 40-inch cord and was like pulling, I-cord bind off pulling, and I could have just had, half of it down, and that would have been more ergonomic as well. It's much easier on joints and muscles not to be picking up your whole project and moving it around and pulling at the cord and all that kind of stuff. But that's just laziness on my part, and not being very considerate of my tools. But yeah, you will at least need 30 to 40 inch cord to pick up all these stitches for the bind off. If not, you will need 2 sets of circular knitting needles. This is not while knitting the project, you can get away with much shorter needles, and you can probably get away with straight needles on certain sections. But that picking up those final stitches, you're definitely going to need at least a 40 inch cord for that. And the reason I went up a needle size is because I do find that the I-cord, I can be really tight when I'm doing my I-cord bind off, and going up to a size 5 was exactly what I needed. And I think it came out perfectly, especially when I'm picking up stitches too. Sometimes I can pick up the stitches a bit too tight. I will also say that, I followed the instructions as far as, pick up the selvage stitches, pick up the live stitches, but there were areas where I had to play around with the pickup in order to get what I believe to be a nice, clean, straight line. Because, you're picking up sections that were knitted separately at maybe a different gauge, at maybe a different, like for instance, there's an area in here where these corners didn't perfectly line up together. And so I kind of played with how to pick up the stitches. And then maybe here, this is where you cast on for the shawl. And then you pick up the selvage here and start knitting here. And so there was kind of a weird shape happening here. And so I had to kind of pick up a couple of more stitches just to make it work, just so this corner was perfectly rounded the way I like. It's me being nitpicky, but if I hadn't done that, I would have had just a bit of a hole between my I-cord and my work. And that's the area where I get nitpicky. When I start binding off, when I start weaving in my edges, weaving in my ends, I start to get very nitpicky. And that's a place where I want it to be a bit picky. Speaking of weaving in ends, all my ends are woven in. I was watching someone who was talking about weaving in ends and then tucking them into the I-cord, and I tried to do that in some places, but it just took a lot of thought just to pull it through, because it kept kind of popping out one end or the other. And I actually saw that technique when I was working on those lion toys. When you do the tail is an I-cord, and then you pull the end through the I-cord tail, and it worked well for that, I think, because that gauge was tighter. But with this looser gauge, I kind of kept stabbing through. So I tried it for a little bit, but then I was like, no, I'm just going to weave it in just the normal way I would weave in, which for garter stitch for me is just a duplicate stitch, because I don't really like to see the lines of my work being woven in. And that's that. That is the process of knitting it. A process that I actually really, really enjoyed. The story behind this shawl is that obviously being a Stephen West fan, I've seen this shawl countless times, and it didn't really do much for me. Like, out of all the shawls I've ever seen, I would look at this one and be like, you know what, that one's not really my favorite. But for some reason, I kept looking at it, and I was like, you know what, I'm just going to give it a chance, especially considering I really wanted to use this yarn. I felt like this would complement that, and it was going to be low stakes, because it was like, I'm not sure about the yarn, and I'm also not sure about the pattern. So if it doesn't work out, I won't be surprised or too down on myself. I definitely went through a roller coaster of emotions. I started off, like I said, not really being a big fan of it. Then I started knitting it, and I started seeing certain colors playing together, and I was enjoying it. It took me a while to figure out my layout. That was probably the hardest part of knitting it, was figuring out which colors were going to be next to each other. But overall, it came together, and I like it. For me, I do have some pros and cons, but they might kind of overlap, because it really just depends on personal preference. As far as the knitting process went, like I said, it felt like it went by really, really fast because you're never knitting on a very large area for a very long time. And so depending on how you feel about that, for me, I don't mind large shawl projects, but this was definitely a different experience and complementary to that attitude of like, oh, I have this little piece I'm doing today, I have this little piece I'm doing tomorrow. And it just depends on what your style is. For me, I do like to get deep into a project. So some of the starting and stopping and being like, well, I guess I'll finish this tomorrow, or, I'd pick up stitches and then be like, okay, I picked up all these stitches. I don't necessarily feel like starting to knit on this section. And so it breaks up the momentum in a way. But like I said, it just depends on what your style is. I do feel like the size is super adjustable. What yarn you use is super adjustable. Like I said, this section here is just going to be bigger or smaller depending on what you use. Like you could use a DK yarn and the shawl would be that much bigger. I was playing with the idea of doing mohair on this section, and it wouldn't have taken very much mohair to do a whole section like that. Ultimately, I wanted to see all the colors play out. For instance, I told y'all last week I was struggling with maybe doing the I-cord in a 6th color and pulling a whole different color into the shawl. But there was something very satisfying about seeing this last color next to all the other colors, so I could really get a feel of what the shawl would have looked like had I done different things. Like, for instance, I get to see this pinkish purple right beside the red and how that might have looked. I really like the purple and the green side by side, which kind of surprises me because that's not one of my favorite color combos. And so I just love the idea of taking a bunch of colors and being like, okay, what if this went with this? And then put you get to see the blue and the green together. Then you see the yellow and the blue beside each other. That was probably the thing I struggled with the most, was picking where colors were going to go. And I still have my doubts. In the end, I do remember why I wanted the yellow. My hand spun, like I was like, oh, I should have done my hand spun by itself, but it is non-superwash, and so I kind of wanted it to be next to the superwash yarn. The actual knitting of it is enjoyable. It's easily adjustable. The steps are super intuitive. So like if you're a brand new knitter, it's easy to follow, but if you are a more seasoned knitter, there's whole sections where you just don't even need the pattern. Like I said, like if you know how to do short rows and you know how to count, you can just put the pattern away and just go until, like I said, until you've picked up all the stitches or until you've resolved all the short rows. There's a lot of sections like that where you can just be on autopilot. But also if you are a relatively new knitter, learning the idea of modular knitting, learning how to pick up and knit, learning how to create all of these different shapes and how all of these different shapes can be helpful in different contexts. Like you could do a whole shawl just of section 6 and how this is knit on the bias and how, you increase on one side, decrease on the other. There's so many, like, I guess you could call them mini shawls inside of this bigger shawl. As far as the knitting process, my other con, which is not necessarily a con, depending on what kind of knitter you are, is the idea that when I started this shawl, it was supposed to be kind of like a stash busting project for me. I really wanted to use all of these yarns, and as you can see, save for the green, I have a lot of yarn left over. Like, for instance, this purple, I have almost 50 grams left in this ball, so almost half a ball left. For me, I like taking on projects that use up my yarn in an efficient manner. And so if I wanted to have used up all this yarn, it would have had to have been maybe a 4-color shawl or a 3-color shawl, because I still have almost 200 grams of yarn left. So like, let's say like I really liked this pattern a lot and I wanted to knit it, and I had gone to my yarn store and carefully planned out a palette for that yarn, and bought 5 brand new skeins of yarn to make this project, I would not have been happy. Let's just put it that way. Because then I have all of this yarn left over that I had planned for a specific project, and now I'm like, now I have to go figure out what I'm going to do with all this extra yarn. So I absolutely would knit this again, but I would knit it at a time where I had like tons of fingering weight scraps, and I would definitely do it in a more scrappy manner than this. Like this whole section here, this could be just one 20-gram scrap you have someplace. I would not, break out the really, nice big 5 skeins, because I guess, and also the final shawl isn't that big, and I did the large size. If I had done the small size, I probably could have gotten 2 of these out of the yarn I had. Understanding that you would have to kind of switch what your dominant color is. Like obviously I couldn't use this color. This is my color B. I would have to use this as maybe what the purple was here, and then maybe I would have to do a different I-cord bind off. So keeping that in mind, but in a couple of years when I have a big basket of fingering weight scraps, this will definitely be something I revisit and something I would have a lot of fun with, and seeing how all those colors play out, and maybe throw in some mohair and stuff like that. So that's the knitting process, which I would give the knitting process probably an A-. The actual final product I am pleasantly surprised with, because one of my big beefs with the Vertices Unite when I see people's finished projects is that me personally, I'm very much, I've been knitting for maybe 3 years, and my familiarity with shawls have been mostly symmetrical. Maybe a half circle, maybe a triangle. And if you're familiar with the Vertices Unite, you do have this point here, but this point is not the halfway point of the shawl. So it's kind of, I guess you could say, I don't know what, how to just, like an isosceles, I guess you would say. But then also, the thing I've never understood when I see people's Vertices Unite, I would see like this kind of strange shaping here. And this is another angle, if you look. And so psychologically, when I see the Vertices Unite, I want it to be a triangle shawl. And so I want it to be like this, and I want this edge to be like super smooth, but it's not. When you actually knit it, you find out, oh, it's not supposed to be smooth. It is another angle. And so when I block this, I plan to aggressively pin out this rectangle, so it is very obvious that it's supposed to be angular in that manner. And the reason it's supposed to be angular in that manner is, one, this is supposed to be a modular look, kind of like a quilted, pieced together look. But also, when you're actually wearing it, which I didn't fully appreciate when I was looking at people's finished objects, it's like perfectly ergonomic. Like it hooks onto your arm very, like, oh, that's how that's supposed to fit, which is kind of genius. And I really, like I said, I didn't appreciate it until I knitted it for myself and put it on. I was like, oh, that's why it's shaped like that. So you have this point at your back where the section 3 comes down, and then it just perfectly, so if you're someone who does not like shawls because you're like, how does it stay on? This is the shawl for you, because it's very long. I am 5'6", so my wingspan is roughly 5'6", and I don't even think I can get this whole thing into frame, but just know this is longer than I am tall. And if I blocked this, and really, really blocked it out, it probably would be like, a good 6 foot long. And I could get it even longer. So if you are that person that's like, I need some functionality with my shawls, then this is the shawl for you. Me personally, I am more of a blanket person, and I was more looking forward to being like totally wrapped up and bundled in my shawl. So yeah, like I said, all of my cons are literally just personal preferences. So I was very much looking forward to something that I could, really cuddle into, with the AC going and with it being It's spring here, but yeah, like I said, the AC has been pumping, and I was looking for something I can more like cuddle up into. But this is more of like it wraps around your arms very easily. It stays on your shoulders really nicely. And if you're like a totally, I am anti shawl, I don't understand shawls, it actually makes quite a nice scarf. And so, because it's not very deep. And I would have liked it to have been deeper, and maybe I'll play around with that when I block it. But if you don't like it like that, don't block it that way, and block it a little bit longer. And this is more so like something I would wear underneath my coat in the winter time. And you can see how that length helps out with that. So like I said, just depends on how you wear your shawls and what you like, and if you don't like shawls or what have you. I do like shawls. Like, I never really understood shawls until I started knitting, and now, like I said, I like to sit and watch TV and wrap up in my shawls. For instance, I brought my cozy corner shawl just to show y'all what I mean about like a deeper shawl and like give you an idea of size. This is my cozy corner shawl, and this is how deep. That's how deep that shawl is. This thing, I can sit down and I can like really, really wrap up in this. And so I was kind of looking for something more like that. This one might be more of like a winter thing. Like I said, something I can put underneath my coat or over top of my coat when I'm driving. Thumbnail. And also the what do you call that? The singles wool and the garter stitch together make it very warm as well. So would I knit it again? Absolutely. I would do it definitely more scrappy. I do know that Stephen West has recently revised the pattern to make certain things more clear, which I thought the pattern was already very clear. I don't know what those revisions are because I own it in print format. I don't own it digitally. But he also he rewrote the pattern. He added some clearer directions. There's also, he has a mini version of the shawl in the pattern that he tells you how to make it, and you can use it as a swatch, and you can use it to plan your colors. He also has like a coloring sheet he put in there, which of course you could make your own coloring sheet if you really wanted to plan out your colors. That's another thing I think is positive about this shawl. If you are someone, I know a lot of people are concerned about how to pick colors. That's not something I really spend too much time thinking about because I just like what I like and I use what I use. But some people do get very wrapped around the axle about how to pick colors for a knitting project, and I think this is a good exercise to see how colors play together and how they look together. Like I said, this blue and this green, that creates a certain effect, but then when you have the blue against the purple, that creates a certain effect. And so if you are someone that wants to get more comfortable playing with color, this is a great project for that. I'm gonna leave it here. I'm gonna block and wash this, and I'm going to come back next week and let y'all know more about the yarn I used, why I used it, and how that process worked for me, especially in regards to my hand spun, especially in regards to using a singles yarn. I'm also very curious and concerned. I went to the grocery store the other day and bought some color catchers because I have not used this dyer before. So I'm just like, I have a big red rectangle on my shawl. How is that gonna work? Am I gonna get bleeding? I will let y'all know all of that next week. I'm also going to let y'all know what am I gonna knit with all of these scraps. I have enough yarn here to do some serious damage, and I have a project planned for this already. And so if y'all tune in next week, am I gonna be able to if y'all tune in next week, maybe y'all will see what I have cast on with that. If I cast on with it within the next week, I think I will cast on with it within the next week. Other than that, have y'all knit the Vertices Unite before? Is it your favorite Stephen West shawl? Why or why not? In 100 words or less. I'm just kidding. Have you knit the Vertices Unite shawl? What are your other favorite shawl patterns? Are you a Stephen West fan? Just how you're doing in general. Are you enjoying either spring or fall, depending on what hemisphere you're up in? Let me know. Until next time, this has been Candy Bee Knittin'. I'm Candy Bee. I'm Bee Knittin'. You can also hit me up on Instagram. I am at Rulude. You can send me an email, candybknittin@gmail.com. DM me on Instagram. You can put comments down below. You can like this video. You can share this video. I don't know if y'all knew any of this stuff. I'm assuming that you guys just all had YouTube just popped up one day and showed you my face, and so maybe you're not aware of any of these things. Until next time, peace.